How Mark Twain Came to Respect the Donkey. He came off the porch in a bluster, a wave of arms. "I'll make that creature do its work," toward his daughters and their obstinate pet. At this remark, the donkey's ears folded back in consternation as Sam climbed aboard. It seems that this donkey wouldn't go unless nursed along with a bag of crackers held before him. And I recall from my youth the riding of donkeys required good balance, as their skin is very loose, no saddle stays on. So this donkey very curtly bent forward and almost gently deposited Clemens in the grass. His daughters rolled with laughter as his mouth dropped open and he stared astonished and amazed at the donkey's seeming compassion in the face of adversity, and ever after claimed respect for the breed, saying he was more attracted to the donkey than ever before because the power to accompany an act of vengeance with so much power and grace and serenity proved the animal to be superhuman. It's entitled Lester Young's Cat. Lester Young was a tenor saxophone player in the 30s and 40s. Well, he lived clear up to 1955. Anyway, here's the poem. It's called Lester Young's Cat. Was named Ding Dong. And when Lester lived in one of those New York City apartments, for a while he was on the first floor, and Ding Dong used to jump in and out the window. Well, as things go, in a probably identical room, Lester moved to the 5th floor. The window was open. Lester was probably pouring a drink. Guess what Ding Dong did? As Lamar Wright told me, Lester said, "Ding Dong Dun Dong." A long walk on a short plank. A lot of dumb mothers out there, all calling themselves gangstas, talking loud as hot asphalt. 3 of them killed this kid outside the check cashing clip joint down on Cedar Avenue in Cleveland for his $68 first paycheck he had earned mopping floors. The 3 years I drove past that place could never get it out of my mind, this vacant and absurd specter. Can you imagine splitting 3 ways $68 in exchange for one life? 2 of the assholes were caught last I heard, and after that it sort of drifted off into an apparition of phantoms near 78th Street. Me and Janet last weekend we were in Colorado, and we went on this one of these old-fashioned trains, these little narrow gauge trains. You drive through the mountains called the Toltec Cumbres. I just wrote this the other day. It was, in the open cattle car of the Toltec Cumbres Scenic Railroad, we stop at the water tank just before hitting Chama, New Mexico. A bunch of tourists on the ground stare at us tourists crammed in the cattle car, and I moo at them. Moo, 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 my hands on the rail, telling Joyce and Alan, "We're fat and summer cows coming down from the high country for slaughter, Soylent Green." Okay, I'll read one more poem. It's entitled The Bible, Guitar, and Furnace Poem. The fix-it man came to fix our furnace, cussed like a sailor at it. "You lousy motherfucker, come on, you big goddamn motherfucking hell." I held the flashlight for him and kept quiet there in the basement. Then he used the phone, and then he went and bought some parts. When he got back, it was another hour before the furnace started cooking. He was proud of his handiwork, and he told me so in so many words. Then, as he carried his toolbox out the door, asked if I was a Christian, which I thought an extremely strange question. But being terminally polite, answered, "Well, I was raised a Christian," which caused Janet to smile, as she knows I'm not much of a God believer. Still perplexed as to why he'd asked such a thing, I noticed my 3 Bibles, a Schofield's, an Oxford, and a King James on the couch, next to my guitar, and the telephone. Then remembered he'd also asked while I held the flashlight beam, "You play guitar?" And not wanting to divert his attention away from the machinery, quickly replied, "A little." He said something about the Christian songs he writes and is entering in the Billboard songwriting contest. Well, God or no God, the heat was finally on after 3 days, and the snow was getting higher.
Eyes like stars sparkle and die, and cycle into new stars, new eyes. The answer is outside our window. Astronomers look for the beginning and find there is no end. Down to earth there are frozen lines, winter trees, stalled cars in dirty snow, sorrow over endings. The real world is through the window, infinite, ageless. Though a clear veil keeps us distant, the soul of what we can never prove keeps us close.
Out of the dusky sun, they stepped into the den. Linoleum-floored music beat, Basin Street, beat, beat, Basin Street. Old men and women kept the beat, one old dude whirling around the floor. Oh my God, how he moved his feet.
Sax, a flute, a drum, trombone, piano, oh what fun! A fuchi, cavassa, rent. Fuchi, cavassa, fuchi, cavassa, fuchi, fuchi, fuchi.
This last old band made my baby plumb mad.
Mad, mad, mad.
Gonna lose that old brain. Gonna lose that old kidney. Gonna lose, man, gonna lose. So play it, play it, play it, play it then.
Fuchi, 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 cavassa, fuchi,
Cabasa.
I gave the dictionary to my man and asked, how do you spell dildo? I can't find it. He asked, are you writing dirty poems again? I said no, but he didn't believe me. He put his finger on the page and said, here, use this one, Dick Dick. It's an African antelope about a foot tall. That's close enough. That's it.
Thank you.
I have a lot of obsessions, and I suppose that's a strange word to use coming from a poet, because a poet is supposed to have art, but I think a poet has obsessions. My obsessions go in all kinds of directions: crime and violence, history, and I suppose in this sense a kind of historically disguised voyeurism. This is a group of poems that came out about 8 years ago under the imprint of Iguana Press in Springfield, Missouri. It's no longer there, it's in Madison, Wisconsin now. One of these fine art type books. The pages are all one page. It's like an accordion. When you can pull it apart, it's like 6 or 7 feet long. When you pull it apart, it's all one page. I got into photography, and I got into a historical photographer by the name of Leighton Alton Huffman, who was a Montana photographer from 1878 to about 1929. And I tried to put myself into his shoes. It was kind of hard to do. I'll read just a few poems out of this to give you a flavor of what this book, and it really is more than just this. This is 10 poems. The whole project was a 100-poem sequence that I'm still looking for a publisher for. The materials of photography. Start with a 5x8 camera plus lens, then a dark tint. Make the shadow inside it seem like the blackest part of a river wave. After that comes the tripod and chemicals: potassium cyanide, nitric acid, collodion, silver nitrate, iron sulfate, alcohol. Also Canton flannel, a package of filters, a quart of varnish, a box of rotten stone, which is glass plate cleaner. Negative boxes, some developing and fixing trays, bottles of various sizes, glass for negatives, finally the scales and weights. Photography is all scales and weights to measure what I see. Let me have a camera that walks the eye right out of the skull and sets me in the very midst of what I see. No detail hidden down to a crease in clothing, a flesh fold sinking through a face. No secrets in anything seen, nothing lost to shadow or the sun. Let me have a camera that sees each angle of a man's face and the canyons of Yellowstone all at once. I want to be able to climb into a wrinkle and know the whole cracked look of the man at that moment. Let me have a camera that bones a pose to the man inside. I want to be the first to photograph a dream. I read this poem up at the Great Bend Conference, Poetry Conference that's sponsored jointly by the Great Bend Public Library and Chiron Review. And this is one of my favorite poems out of this book. In a sense, I think it still defines the way that people dress themselves and act in public. In this country, a man's hat is not just something he wears. It constitutes a statement. The angle of his walk, the way he sits a horse, talks, or looks, call it a sacred relic to be taken off or put back on with great ceremony. A man with his hat on in a photograph doesn't need a name. I'll read the last one out of this collection. Looking west through my camera lens, past the hunter who squats next to a dead elk. Blood is coming out of its mouth. Behind him, mountains rise up, humped questions the earth poses. I strain to see the trees on those tangled north slopes, and beyond them, the fingers of snow leaking and spilling into ravines. That is as far as my camera can see. Clouds obscure the peaks. All the rest I have to imagine. I'm going to go into an area of what I call private history. We all have our public and private histories, our public and private obsessions. And it took me a long time to come to this. I've been writing, well, the first book of poetry I sort of scraped the surface. First book of poetry I ever had that was brought out, The Man in the Black Chevrolet. I wrote some poems about my father. And at that time I thought I'd dealt with the whole thing. And I guess when you write poetry, you sort of have to scrape open the little wound that you have, and everybody's got one, in order to find out where you are, in order to find your voice, in order to find what you're going to write about, in order to find your history, in order to find yourself. And so I had to do that. My father was an alcoholic, and I had to deal with that. And he was also a man who was a failed writer. Probably the biggest influence on my life, because as a kid, 10, 12 years old, being around him, watching him trying to write novels that really went no place. And I suppose it became a kind of challenge for me to try to do some kind of writing and see what I could do with it. So a few of these poems really come, and it comes out of a collection called Burning My Name, which appeared in Bog magazine about 2 or 3 years ago. This was one of the hard poems I had to write, and I wrote this really not thinking that I would be writing any more about him. This was kind of like thinking, well, this is it, I'm dealing with this is it. When my father was about 50 years old, he reached a point where he decided he knew he wasn't going to do anything with writing. So he burned his novel, and he asked me to help him do it. So this is that poem. Helping my father burn his novel, a Western. He'd hand me the pages a few at a time, and I'd stuff them into an old trash barrel next to a junk stove behind the hotel. Here's the big gunfight chapter, he'd say, flames going higher than his hand. We can still stop. I know all this stuff that happened this far. Father would wave the offer away and hand me more. Then he'd chug some whiskey and make a face. The last thing he said that afternoon was, "You have to be drunk to do this. It's like burning my name." The downstairs neighbor pounding on the door was the first I'd heard the house was on fire. I never even smelled the smoke, though I heard a crazy ticking in the walls. I grabbed my billfold, forgot my ring and watch. When I turned around, the room where I keep my typewriter was going. It almost seemed as though I could hear the alphabet burning. Thanks to Belinda that this came out through her press. I guess I've kind of built up a noir reputation in this country. Noir meaning dark. I've always been attracted to outlaws. I've always been attracted to the dark side of life. I've always been attracted to acts of violence, partly because I was raised in a milieu when I was a kid that it's where that flourished. Okay, I'm going to read a couple of Dillingers. Let me talk about Dillinger just for a minute. I'll read a couple of Dillingers and that's it. 86. Dillinger was a Midwestern outlaw in the early 30s. Charismatic. For about 6 or 8 months he held the nation's headlines. Robbed a mess of banks. Supposed to have killed one man. And became interesting for some strange reason to me about 20 years ago when I started writing. The entire poem is somewhere between 30 and 35,000 lines long. It comprises 22 long sections and one section of short poems, probably somewhere about 400 or 500 poems. And I'll just read a couple. Six-year-old kid watching Dillinger admire his reflection in the Hudson Terraplane walked over to touch the Thompson. He jumped when Dillinger swung the barrel, making long shadows in the air. Want to hold it? The kid took 2 steps back, then smiled. Dillinger said, "Whatever you do, don't touch that." He was pointing at the trigger. The gun's weight dragged the kid's arms down. When Dillinger thought the kid was going to let go, he took it back. "What makes it weigh so much?" the kid asked. "Death," Dillinger said. "It sits way back in the barrel, and the dark makes it fat." And then the last one, Dillinger had a fixation about submachine guns, and he was photographed several times holding one. Dillinger thinking about what it must feel like to be killed by a machine gun. First pieces of clothing fly off like a cluster of frightened sparrows in all directions. Then 45 shave patches of flesh and bone as though this is the ultimate strip show. No Sally Rand fans to hide this stuff. The victim remaining briefly alive to watch the surprise blood spanked into fine drops, a red sneeze the shaking body makes. Those places hit by slugs dance to a dull, numbing cold, and the hands won't come up, and the heart's reduced to a few walloped pigeon flops inside the ribs. Then language turns to maggots in the skull. Thank you.